Today on Conversations Aloud, we're discussing how to get citizens more engaged in democracy. We're joined by Marjan Ahsassi, who is a strategic policy advisor. She's a lawyer, and she's worked to enhance space for civil society in some of the most complex environments, including Iran, Ukraine, and North Korea. Now, she focuses on the development and adoption of democratic innovations in the US as well as overseas, striving to empower everyday citizens to take part in the policy making process. She has a new book called The Activated Citizenship: The Transformative Power of Citizens' Assemblies, which will go into that. Welcome to the show, Marjan.
Thank you so much, Hadi. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So, to kick things off, what makes a country a democracy aside from kind of the voting and the free elections?
I love that you say aside from the voting and the elections, because that is part of the problem in the United States, right? We have a very minimalistic definition of what our democracy is. And often when you ask people how they're involved in their democracy, we inevitably talk about voting and elections. And so to me, a democracy, especially in the context of the US, but also abroad, is a government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I think that kind of the way that we frame it in the US is quite apt to describe the ways that I mean that a democracy should be of, by, and for the people. So it certainly should be of the people in the sense that it should be the government should be representative of the people and their wishes. And so the leaders should be people who have been elected by citizens to govern. But it also needs to be by and for the people, which means that in between elections, there have to be mechanisms for us to be able to hold our government accountable, because we are asking our citizens to live by laws and by rules and regulations that are very often decided on by our elected representatives without really gauging interest. And so if you look at the data, every few years we are becoming further and further separated from the idea that our policies should be reflective of citizens' preferences. And so, to me, a democracy is a democracy when the policies and the laws that we're asking people to live by are laws and policies that they have been involved in. They have had a say in enacting them. And so that means having a seat at the table.
I love that. And I think for a lot of people, they're struggling to see the for the people part because it seems like they're even maybe voting people in, but suddenly lobbying comes in, this comes in, and the policies that they thought they were voting for
Mhm.
are not aligned. They don't actually come into practice. And so they're feeling very disenfranchised. It's at a low. Is are people at a low in terms of engagement with political institutions?
So that's such a complicated question, but a really good question. So let's just take the election that we just had. We actually have seen over the past couple of elections in the United States, voter turnout has been great, right? To me,
Yeah.
when I speak, and I was speaking to someone at the League of Women Voters last week, they have seen more and more women come to their website because they want to be engaged. So I think that there is a disconnect. So yes, people want to be more and more engaged. I think what we're seeing, and if you look at it in the context of broader democracies, we are having an anti-incumbent moment right now in the world, where most of those who are going to cast their vote are wanting change. People are not voting for the incumbent, so incumbents are not being successful. To me, that is rather daunting because some of those results are daunting for some of us. But at the same time, it speaks to an opportunity. People who want change people are voting this way because they want change. And so in this, to me, this signals an opportunity for us to actually leverage the number of people who are wanting to be involved in ways that gives them actually meaningful input, which is not what we're doing. We are not changing the ways that we are doing our democracy so that we use this incredible and we mobilize this incredible population that wants to be more involved.
Got it. Okay, so what you're saying is that people are actually hungry to be engaged and to engage, but maybe there isn't that opportunity to help them, engage aside from just voting.
In more meaningful ways. Yes, in my book, I introduce the concept of voice insecurity, which, much like food insecurity, I'm talking about not having adequate access to real food when we talk about food insecurity. in terms of voice insecurity, when I talk about voice insecurity, I don't mean that people in the United States can't go stand in a corner and speak their mind, or that there aren't outlets where you can write your opinion. But what I talk about is the fact that we don't have a say, a meaningful say and consequential voice in the policies that we're asked to live by.
Okay. And how do we change that? How do we get more people engaged in those policies?
So it's such a good question. So I used to work in international development. I spent about 15 years in international development working at the World Bank, at the National Democratic Institute, at the American Bar Association. And then after 2016, 17, I just felt like I really wanted to focus on the United States. And there were several reasons for this. But I went back to school and did my doctoral degree. And at the time, what I was interested in, Hadi, was why are citizens in Western democracies so disengaged from political institutions? And are there platforms that allow them to engage in more meaningful ways? And so I knew about deliberative democracy, but I didn't know about the process of citizens' assemblies. So I had my aha moment when I discovered citizens' assemblies, first in France, and then I worked with them in Belgium and then in Canada, and I've been following them for the past 5 years. But citizens' assemblies are a great example of a way in which government can really bring citizens to the table in a more meaningful way. And I'm happy to share kind of what makes a citizens' assembly a citizens' assembly.
Yes, please. Share, what is a citizen assembly, and how is it different maybe to voting or other forums that are already available?
Sure. So citizens' assemblies are typically, when we talk about assemblies, I talk about four non negotiable elements of an assembly. So the very first one is that we have a government body. Now, this could be at the local level. We've worked with mayors, with city council members, or at the national level. It could be sort of something that's run, just like I was involved last year in France on the Citizens Convention on the End of Life, which was something the president of France had commissioned to understand whether the population in France wanted a change to introduce that would allow the introduction of euthanasia and assisted suicide. So my point is it can be at different levels, but basically you have a government body that wants citizen input because they're willing to change a law or a policy. So there's policy reform, there's a public problem, and there's a government body that wants to hear from its citizens. So that's number one. The second piece is that we always, for a citizens assembly, we always use a process called sortition or democratic lottery, which allows us to really bring a representative sampling of people to the table. So often, our electeds will think that they're really allowing anybody to come. I mean, I talk to electeds all the time, and they're like, no, anybody could come to my town hall. Anybody can come to my community conversation because we have sign-up sheets. So what we do with democratic lottery and sortition is we send out about 7 to 10,000 letters to a population. So again, it could be the state, it could be the city, or it could be the country. And we tell people what it is that the government wants to change policy around, and we invite them to the sessions. So we'll have a pool of people who will respond and say, yes, we want to be involved. From that pool, we use criteria. We usually have 6 to 7 or 8 criteria depending on the circumstances. So usually race, age, socioeconomics, gender. We use that criteria to be able to then put together a platform that truly represents that community in terms of percentages. And so, having done citizen engagement all over the world for now 17, 18 years, there is no body of people that you bring into a citizen engagement process that is as representative as a citizens assembly. So that's the
Hmm.
second piece. The third piece, and this is really important because of the moment we're in with polarization and also pervasive loneliness across the United States, but also elsewhere. So the very first phase of a citizens' assembly starts with learning. So before people start arguing and debating over the issue that they're there to discuss, there's learning. So 1/3 of a citizens' assembly is spent listening to experts, stakeholders, community groups, people with lived experience talk about the issue. So if it's homelessness, housing affordability, drug policy, childcare, they meet with experts first. And so that allows them to really learn about the subject before they start engaging in deliberation. So that's phase one. Phase two is then both in plenary session, which means,
Right. Before
yeah.
before we go to phase two, so just to summarize, because this is really interesting. So it's government driven.
Mhm,
The government requests people to participate by sending out letters to see if they want to join in kind of this kind of partnership, I guess, with government to create that policy. And those assemblies are representative of kind of the population,
mhm,
which is great. And then you come in first and you learn about the policy
mhm,
and listen, which is difficult in today's age because everyone has opinions. Everyone is an expert these days about everything.
Yes.
Um, and so that is how do you get people to come and listen and engage and maybe change perspective before we go to phase two?
So, I mean, if you're asking about who comes through the door, is that what you're asking? Like who applies, who says, yes, I'm happy to do this and I'm willing to do this?
More about the process that allows people to learn and participate in that learning process and change perspective maybe because usually what happens is that people already have an idea or an opinion that they think is based on facts, and the other person has another opinion that they think is based on facts,
Yeah.
and so there's a clash of ideas. How do you bring those people together and change that perspective?
So this is the magic of citizens assemblies. This is some of the magic, is that I think we think that people are incredibly polarized, right? And we think that people can't speak to each other because often what will happen is people will clash because they're face to face to each other with each other, and you have an opinion about something, and before I actually listen to what you have to say, or I say, well, Hadi, why don't we actually hear from someone who's a little bit more objective about the issue before we have our argument, right? And so that's what we try and do. We create a place where, and it takes a lot of time to curate the evidence and select the experts who speak to a citizens assembly, because we work really hard to make sure that they're balanced. So we have, academics who speak from a very objective standpoint, or we have people who are stakeholders. But if we introduce one side of the argument, we also make sure to introduce the other side of the argument. And so
Okay.
the research that we do shows very much, very, very easily that people will change their opinion. So we do surveys at the beginning, and people will say, we'll ask them, are you really set in your position about this, right? And some people will say yes, and they think that nothing's going to change their opinion. And then there are people who come because they truly are interested in learning more, and they have an opinion, but they come in with this mindset that their opinion might change, right? But I agree with you. I think in the day and age that we're in, most people come in kind of thinking that they're going to dig their heels and that they know what they believe. But it is incredible. I mean, we don't have to tell them that you're going to change your opinion. The fact that they sit there for hours, for days, right, and are hearing experts give them their opinion about different things, you see that they change. I mean, I have had, and by my book, I have four case studies in the book, but I have had so many people come to me and say, Marjan, I have learned that all the information that I was like relying on, the sources of information are wrong. I will never listen to this anymore. I will never listen to that anymore. So
Mm,
we don't have to tell them, but the fact that there is this segment, this first part of a citizens assembly that is around learning before we argue with each other, just brings them together. And so, it is incredible to see how civil people are with each other. And it is also incredible to see that when they come, they're not there to just defend their position. The way that we frame the assembly is that you have been chosen to represent other residents, right, in this forum
mm,
to help us think and write policy proposals. Right? So they take their
mm.
job very seriously. So even if I have an opinion, I want to make sure that my opinion is rooted in the best interest of my community. And you see that
'Cause now
transfer.
they're the representative in a way.
They're what? Yes,
Now they're the representative of the people.
exactly.
So yeah, and that's amazing because also it builds that sense of community, right? That I am part of this nation and I'm involved, and not only am I engaging, I'm being informed now of different ideas and sharing that with people that maybe I wouldn't have spoken to because I live in a different community.
And those relationships continue, that sense of
Yeah.
community. So the five variables that in my book I look at, so I created a definition of what an engaged citizen looks like in a democracy, and the very first variable was learning. So are they learning more? And that's a piece that I actually think that government is completely neglecting. Like, how do we
Mm,
actually make sure, and it's beyond civics learning, it's how do we make sure that our citizens are informed, right? So one part of my study is around how citizens assemblies increase learning, and not just about the issue. So, not just about homelessness or housing affordability or euthanasia, but people also learn about government. So, by being together and by writing proposals and learning together, they learn about the trade offs and the compromises that people have to make in government. And so, they leave this experience with a greater sense of government and understanding of government and appreciation for that. So that's one variable. The second variable that I look at is exactly what you said, connectedness. So is there a greater sense of connectedness? And especially now with, all the studies that we read about this pervasive sense of loneliness, that has certainly has gotten worse, not just with social media, but also post pandemic. And people come and they have a sense of belonging, which is a beautiful feeling. And you see that emerging from the group. Another piece that I look at is effervescence. So I think we've forgotten that people should be excited about participating in their democracy. And so in my study, I look at whether people are more enthusiastic about being part of a democracy. And sure enough, when they participate in a citizens' assembly and they come together and government has asked them to write proposals, like who's ever had that opportunity? They get excited, they feel important. They feel like their input is meaningful. And then the other two that I look at is obviously one of them is participation. Are they participating more? And inevitably, and we've seen this with some, we just finished a case study in Yukon in Canada. It's a citizens' assembly on electoral reform. And of the 38 participants of that citizens' assembly, 3 of them ran their own campaigns to become elected. So that's
Mm.
how they're transformed. And then the last
Yeah.
piece that I look at is voice and whether people feel like their voice is more meaningful.
Yeah, and you're touching on so many human needs: belonging, being heard, purpose, feeling that you're contributing, you're giving back. These are all kind of the essential human needs that sometimes in this society we're not really getting fed or kind of aligning to. Going to phase two, what happens in phase two?
So phase 2 is then the deliberation. So once they've had a chance to learn about the issue, and I don't mean to suggest that the learning ends, because the learning really doesn't end until the very end, really, even then. But we finish the learning process and we move into the deliberation. And the deliberation is where we try and start having conversations about the issue, and proposals start slowly emerging. And so we will have deliberation in small groups. And this is where the facilitation is really important, because we don't want the groups to be too large typically. And this varies from country to country, but we will have small group discussions of about 8 to 10 people at one table with facilitators. And then part of it is also in plenary session. So they start thinking about the question, because the question that they've been invited is one question. It's what we call a remit in Citizens Assembly language, or a mandate. And so they start thinking about proposals around that remit. And so we then have the drafting of proposals begins, which leads to the last phase, which is the writing of the proposals, the finalizing of the proposals, that then becomes a final report that is then submitted. And this is the very last piece. It's then submitted to the same government body that kind of commissioned the Citizens Assembly at the end.
Okay, so you at the end get a report, which is like an analysis, or what's kind of in the report?
So the best reports that I have seen will have a manifesto, which is kind of a statement on behalf of all of the assembly members. That's generally written by a few of the assembly members, and others have okayed it. So everybody gets a chance to edit it. And then it's an actual list of proposals. So you have the proposals written out by the assembly members with the help of facilitators sometimes. So in a coherent way. And we try, which is really important to me, is that the proposals be really well justified, right? So that, because ultimately you're handing it to an elected representative, and you want to make sure that they understand where this is coming from, and also what you want them to do with this. In some cases, we also have them vote. So you'll have a list of proposals with percentages of voting. So you know how much consensus there was over one proposal versus another proposal. So 92% of the assembly members voted in favor of this proposal, but only, let's say, 65% voted in favor of this proposal. We usually don't have proposals that gain less than 2/3 of the majority, or in some cases, at least above majority. And then
Okay.
what I also like is a minority report. So we'll also have a minority report in the final report.
So how does the government use this?
So the government, it depends. It depends on the government body. It depends on whether it goes to, let's say, like in France, the euthanasia report is in front of the Assemblée nationale in France, because they need legislative change. So President Macron has accepted that report and has given it to the legislators and has said, 76% of the French population want a change in the law. I want you to present me with a change in the law. a proposal for a
Mhm.
change in the law.
So
So
that actually caused a change in the law.
exactly.
Uh,
So that's the
and
policy impact that they will have. But in other
mm,
cases, let's say it's about homelessness and it's at the city level, you will have different agencies that will then consider the proposals. What we ask for as advocates or people who are implementing this is that government makes a commitment to come back and respond to people within 6 to 9 months. So these processes are not binding, they're consultative. And I think that's really important for your listeners to know is that what we ask government to do is to review the proposals, to take them seriously, to consider them seriously, and then to respond to people and say, okay, we are going to implement this proposal, but we're not going to implement this proposal, and this is why.
got it. Okay. And so when those people come in, how many people are we talking about
The
in
assembly
the
members.
assembly?
So
Yeah.
we generally say no fewer. I mean, you want to be 40 and up because you want it to be truly representative. So even in a small town, you want there to be more than 40 generally participants. And I have done these for with over 185 people.
Okay, nice. And so how does this work? So like, do they is it all from one city? How long do they have with each other? How do they kind of juggle this with other commitments? How do you find that apply?
So part of the issue is, and you're asking great questions. One of them is, so okay, we got them in the door. How do we keep them in the door? Because you want them, you don't want to have turnover, right? So let's say you pick 48 assembly members from a city. We usually will have a stipend, so people will receive a certain amount per day. There are places like Canada doesn't offer stipends for their assembly members. By the way,
So what's a
Canada,
side pen?
sorry.
What's a side pen?
A stipend is a daily allowance. So they will receive a daily
Okay.
allowance for the work that they're doing. Generally speaking, assemblies are happening Friday evening, Saturday, and Sundays. So it's on days when most people aren't working, but we still want to make sure that we compensate them, right? In countries like Canada, they won't compensate people as a matter of fact. They will compensate you if there's a need. So if assembly members feel like they need the financial contribution, then they will make sure that they receive the stipend or the compensation. And then there are other measures that we take, like we make sure that there's childcare. We make sure that we pay for their transportation costs. You asked whether they meet in one city. So depending, I mean, I've done these at the national level and also at the local level. If they're at the local level, often they will go back to their homes in the evening. If it's a national one and it's in person, then of course you will fly them. In terms of number of sessions, much of this is driven by budgets. Citizens' assemblies are expensive. They're a great way of engaging with your citizens, but they're more expensive than a town hall. And so what we will do is, depending on the budget, we often will say, and I write this in my book, for me the minimum number of days that you need are 4 days. And why do I say 4 days? Because I think you need at least one day for learning. You need at least one day for real deliberation and writing of proposals. And you need at least one day for finalizing the proposals, really making them well justified. And then the fourth day when you prepare your assembly members to then be able to submit their final report to government. Um, More than that is absolutely desirable. The case study that I mentioned to you in France was over 9 weekends. So that was 27 days.
That's the euthanasia.
Sorry?
Um, that was about assisted dying.
Yes, that was about assisted
Yeah.
dying and assisted suicide and euthanasia. Yes.
Got it. Okay. So usually it's maybe so 4 days over like 2 weeks.
So no, so we generally will have one weekend free because you don't use, so you said, what about other people's responsibilities? Everyone's busy, and we want to make sure that we make it as easy for people to participate, and also that we really try and level the playing field, right? One of the populations that's hard for us to get are single mothers. It's very hard for them to leave their children. They need childcare. They can't do every weekend. So what we typically try and do is we give a weekend, we engage with them one weekend, and we have at least one weekend, if not 2 weekends off. So we'll do these over a process of maybe 4 to 5 months.
Got it. Okay. So a lot of people will listen to this,
Mhm.
and to me, this sounds very exciting. But they will say, shouldn't policies be driven by experts? And how do you kind of manage because obviously we want citizens to be engaged and participate, but also be driven by those experts that have that knowledge. How do you balance that?
So it's a great question. So I think, the reason we think, first of all, I think, the the public is just not being used in the way that it should. And so we're not saying that, citizens should replace experts, because as I said again, the learning phase is so that they can hear from experts. So we have experts come and share their knowledge with them. What we're trying to do is we're trying to strengthen the relationship and the connection between citizens and their government, so that they feel that while experts may be doing a lot of this work and they're relying on experts for their learning, they have a seat at the table, right? So they can actually come and say on gun reform, on abortion rights, they can say, you know what, 48 of us are here, we're listening to the experts, and this is the kind of policy that we want our government to consider. Now, I will also say to you that there are citizens' assembly processes that will have citizens write policy, right, proposals, but at the same time, they will also have experts do the same work. So these two systems work in parallel with each other. And at the end,
Mm.
the government has a final report that's submitted by citizens and a final report that they have from their experts. And they get a chance to weigh both of these reports, which I think is a wonderful way of doing this.
Okay, so it doesn't replace anything. It's in tandem with the experts. It's working together.
Yes, I mean, we do not in any way. I mean, there are maybe some advocates who believe that, citizens' assemblies over time may replace our representative democracies. But for us, citizens' assemblies are really a way to complement the way that we do governance. And if you look at it, I mean, our governance systems are outdated. If I often say to myself, like, if anybody were to go look for a job, right, you would never apply to work for a company that hasn't revived, renewed, reconsidered its governance models in 50 years, 60 years, So you wouldn't look at a school for your children if you felt that their governance models are the same as they were 50 years ago. So these are ways that we're proposing to really rethink the way that we engage with our citizens. And frankly, to try, given especially the levels of trust that we see across our democracies, ways to really engage with citizens and give them a seat at the table. And also, I will just mention that citizens don't think of themselves as experts. They are very, very happy. Most of the citizens that I've talked to have said, my job isn't to write a policy that will then definitely become, write a proposal that will definitely become policy, but I want to be engaged. I want to have meaningful input. I'm tired of going to town halls where I just sit there, people talk to me or at me, and they're not really asking for my feedback.
Yeah, yeah. And so do you think this will work even when there is a low trust in government, that this kind of engagement in assemblies will work?
100%. So, what I will say is that, and I often say that the practice of citizens' assemblies and the potential of citizens' assemblies are two different things. So, and what do I mean by that? I mean that in some situations, we use citizens' assemblies just as a band aid solution. So, in Europe, especially because they've exploded and we see a lot of citizens' assemblies being used, sometimes they're just used because government kind of says, okay, well, let's just bring some citizens together. But those proposals aren't really paid attention to, right? And there isn't real policy impact. So in those cases, sometimes trust actually not only doesn't go up, but might actually even go down, because you've brought citizens together, you've told them that they're going to take them seriously, and you don't. So I think governments that use citizens' assemblies really need to think thoughtfully about this. But in situations where you bring citizens together and there's a real commitment from government because they want to engage with citizens and they're really curious to hear what citizens might propose to them, and then there's real policy follow up, in those cases, 100% we see trust going up.
That's interesting. So you're saying basically governments actually have to have real buy-in, because if they do kind of this just exercise of let's tick the box and engage citizens but not listen to them, it does the opposite. You have lower trust even in government.
It can do that. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. So I do think that, and I think you can't pay lip service, right? You really have to take this seriously. And yes, but where government really takes it seriously, and I often will say, workshopping these ideas with a government agency that wants to do this and making sure that they understand what types of policy change they might have to make and that they're actually on board for that is really important before you start your citizens assembly.
And what is the uptake on this from governments? And how do you see us increasing that uptake?
So I love to have these conversations because I will say to you, last year when we launched the Federation, so we launched a new organization called the Federation for Innovation and Democracy North America. I'm the executive director of, and we launched it in April. So Canada, again, has had a long history and a long tradition of deliberation. In the United States, we have a long history of deliberative democracy, but not so much where citizens and government are working together. So we do deliberative democracy more to engage in community conversations. Last year, when we started this, there's an organization, an amazing organization in Oregon called Healthy Democracy, and they probably have in the United States the longest history with sortition based models where they've used citizens assembly type models, and they had one citizens assembly in Petaluma, and that's included in my book. But there weren't many instances of citizens assemblies. So just in the past year, we've had two capacity building schools in the United States, and more we're seeing cities that are very interested. So at the local level, we're seeing a huge growth in interest across the United States.
That's interesting. How do you see the uptake with young people? Because I know for a lot of young people, they typically have, especially now, more anxiety about engaging in these things, and they like to do most things online. So are you seeing younger people kind of being involved in this process?
So another great question. So the young people that I have seen who have participated, who have come to a citizens assembly, I can tell you, Hadi, their relationship with government changes forever. I mean, and in Europe, sometimes they have 16-year-olds. So 16-year-olds or 18-year-olds who are invited to be part of a citizens assembly, who arrive, who meet with the mayor or meet with the president of the country and have occasion to ask people questions and then are engaged in learning and writing policy. It is tremendous how engaged they become. I agree with you that for the most part, we are seeing, young people who, even if they're interested in government, feel like they should go into other sectors to then have an impact on government, which I find living in Washington, D.C., and having raised two children in Washington, D.C., it is unfortunate to me to see in some cases the future of this country not being very engaged with government and public service. Um, I do think that many of them are interested. They just don't have the right platforms. They're tired of the type of democracy that we're asking them to live in, which is one that doesn't really give them voice. Going back to, again, voice and security, I don't think that there are sufficient platforms and interventions where young people really feel like they can be involved in government's work alongside government. So I do think that if we use citizens assemblies more and more, we will see more interest in young people being involved. You're right. I mean, the question about social sort of being online more than in person is a good one. And one of the things that we do test with, and a lot of really great practitioners have been doing this, is to mix citizens assemblies so that they're in person, but also online.
Yeah, and I guess it touches on that cost because it can be costly to have these assemblies, and we want more people to engage. So, is there? How do you envisage the future for this, where we have a lot more of these assemblies? Do you think there's going to be kind of a combination of online and in person, or is there some kind of do you see it evolving into something else? This model.
So two things. One is there's a funding issue, right? So yes, part of the role of our government is to educate our organization, FIDE North America, is to educate Americans about this idea, but then to also help accelerate the number of them. There's a real funding issue in the United States for any kind of strengthening democracy work in the US. So having worked in international development before, it is really has been very surprising to me to see that we have so much money for international development work and strengthening democracies outside of the United States, but so little funding within the United States. So I do think that we need an agency that is dedicated to supporting advocates and implementers that want to do this kind of work in the United States. A colleague of mine in Canada and I have also kind of proposed something called the Democratic Action Fund, which asks government at the local level or at the national level to put 5 to 7% of the amount of money that's spent on elections. Like I just heard that this recent election in the United States cost us $20 billion. I mean, that is just
Wow.
outrageous. And so, what we're asking for, and we have a website, the Democratic Action Fund website, we ask government to really consider putting a very small amount. I mean, 5 to 7% is negligible. 5 to 7% of the amount that we spend on elections in a fund that would allow sort of citizens' assemblies to happen at every level, at the local level, at the state level, at the national
Awesome.
level.
It just reminded me of a movie that was directed by Jon Stewart. I don't know if you've seen it, about funding and elections,
Yeah.
and it's basically this small village tricks both parties that it's a close race, and so all the money kind of comes in, but then they find a loophole, a legal loophole, where they can actually use the money to impact the city, as opposed to just for the Republican versus Democrat. It's a great comedy kind of movie
I
to,
love
to
that. Is
watch
it
it.
a new movie?
It's a good movie. Yeah, yeah, it's a very good movie.
I will definitely.
Um, so you mentioned their international aspects. You know, I'm originally from Iraq. You've lived in Iran. Is it too hopeful to think that one day this kind of process might actually happen there? Have you seen any kind of developments that maybe we will go there one day?
You mean happen in our countries of origin?
Yeah, yeah, in Iran and those kind of assemblies.
Yeah, well, so it's an interesting question. I think there are two answers that I'd like to give. One of them is that, interestingly, agencies like USAID, so the US Agency for International Development, I just gave a presentation there last week. So our agencies that do that kind of work abroad are far more innovative. And so they're already interested in doing citizens assemblies and helping countries that receive funding from USAID try and test with citizens assemblies. So I'm not sure about Iraq and Iran specifically, but USAID is certainly trying to help with this process abroad. In terms of Iran and Iraq specifically,
Sorry, just on that.
yeah.
Are you saying that they're linking aid with creating these assemblies?
Not linking aid, but proposing. I mean, USAID has lots of learnings that they provide to the different missions around the world. And so part of that is to help them become more and more innovative and learn about the different tools that are being used in other parts of the world. And for me, it's been interesting that we're teaching this to our missions around the world before we're actually even implementing them in the United States. So there is a disconnect in the way that we are almost more innovative in our international development practices than we are at home. So that's a point. So they are doing that. They're becoming increasingly interested in deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies abroad. In terms of the country specifically, I mean, I will say to you that we also have to be very careful, right? Because citizens' assemblies can be co opted. So you can pretend as an elected government that you're doing a citizens' assembly, but if you're not really using democratic lottery and sortition, and you're just bringing a group of people that will say what you want them to say, and then you're going to use that final report and the proposals to then push a certain agenda. Those are ways in which citizens' assemblies can be co opted and manipulated. And we do see that in different parts of the world. So the same response that I would give for the United States. At the national level, I would love to see the United States do a national assembly on a topic like housing affordability that is of great interest to Americans across the country. And it's a bipartisan issue. It's not a Democrat issue, it's not a Republican issue. But if a White House were to engage in this, it would be really important that there is what we call designing for legitimacy and that there is process integrity. So, as long as we follow the processes that I sort of kind of very briefly mentioned to you, then I think any country around the world can use a citizens' assembly to be able to bring people together and sort of really see what type of rough consensus they can get from a representative sampling of people.
Mm. And what country are you seeing right now using this model the most?
So it's a very good question. I mean, mostly Western Europe is where we're seeing it. So the OECD did a report a few years ago called the Deliberative Wave, where they have a database that is kind of collecting the number of citizens' assemblies that are happening. And apparently there are about 800 or so that were waiting for the new report to come out. Most of these are in Western Europe. France is a great example. Belgium is a huge example and a user of citizens' assemblies. Germany has many. Ireland has had many, many citizens' assemblies that have had huge impact, constitutional change. So in Ireland, and we often talk about Ireland as the gold standard of citizens' assemblies, but they have had citizens' assemblies that have helped with abortion, so changing and allowing abortion. Same sex marriage was driven by a citizens' assembly. And then
Okay.
the other piece that's really important is that to talk about is what we're now seeing as well is that people are moving from ad hoc assemblies to assemblies becoming permanent institutions within their governance. So the city of Paris has a permanent citizens assembly now. The country Germany, the German Bundestag, the parliament, tested with their first permanent citizens assembly last year on nutrition.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Great developments happening. Um, just before we go into your book, democracy for a lot of people, it's something that they take for granted. Especially if you've always been surrounded by it because you know nothing else. It's like having hands or legs. It's
Yeah.
You don't wake up every day and be like, oh my god, I've got my hands and I've got my legs, because it's just so part of your normal life. You don't actually appreciate these things until they're taken away.
Yeah.
But as you kind of moved to the US, was there a moment where you really kind of, wow, democracy, that's something very special, or did it just happen over time for you?
For me, so it's interesting you say that because I don't think that I came to the US and realized how amazing democracy was. I think what I often will say is those of us who lived in countries that weren't democratic and didn't really have democracies don't take our democracy for granted. So I think from the moment that I moved to the United States to practice law first, and I was in New York City.
Was that from where you
I
moved?
was in Canada. So I went to law
Okay.
school. I went to college and law school in Canada and then moved to the US, where I had lived when I was a child because my dad used to work for the United Nations. He was with the Iranian delegation to the United Nations before the revolution.
Hmm.
And I had lived in Iran from the age of 10 to 18 during the revolution and during the war with Iraq. So I lived in Iran those years. And I think, you have a sense for what a democracy should be as a child. And I lived in a very political family. So, what was very sad for me is not that I had came to the US and I had this aha moment of like, oh, this is what democracy should be like. I actually came to the US, and when we moved to Washington and soon after had children, I realized that this democracy is really not meeting the needs of its people. And so I started to have real questions about, is this really the best that we can do? Is this really what a democracy is? And some of it came around, honestly, food insecurities around Washington, D.C., where children in public schools don't have enough food. Like that cannot be the United States. And so I have not actually, I've had more questions, I guess, about this democracy, I would say. But because I was an immigrant, I felt like my value add was more in doing international work because I spoke different languages and I wasn't really focusing on the US. For me, it was after the 2016 election where I really started feeling like I couldn't travel around the world trying to help other democracies when ours really needed more attention. But I agree
Okay.
with you. I actually still think that we're still in a coma. I still don't think we're getting that, this democracy really, really needs some serious attention. And some of that is just by being innovative and imaginative about what we want from our democracy.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's not just about voting. There's so much more to it. And sometimes, something looks like democracy on paper, but when you kind of dig deeper, there's a lot of issues there that need solving. And to your point, sometimes the US, I guess it's moving away from spreading democracy, as they say, towards actually working on their own democracy, which might also be one of the reasons why the US kind of went on Trump with the idea that US first, everything else second. Let's try that model because the US has always been, let's focus on outside than inside.
But
Um,
I think if I could just also add, I think, but we still, we're talking more and more about the importance of democracy in between elections. So I think that there's growing recognition that we need to address that space in between elections and that democracy is beyond elections and beyond the ballot box. But what I don't think we're still doing is really thinking about ways to bring government and citizens together. So, we often will talk about polarization. How do we address polarization? And it's always about community dialogues. That's important. I'm not saying that shouldn't be important, but some of this issue should also be between citizens and government. So we need more programs like citizens' assemblies that actually put government and citizens at the same table together.
100%. Marjan, for someone who maybe is thinking of looking into your book, what's something that they would get out of it?
So I think thank you for asking me that question. I think that so the book is really my doctoral thesis that we've turned into a book. It is very much geared towards an American public that doesn't know as much about citizens' assemblies. So the first chapter really starts about some democratic deficit. So I think if someone's interested, I'm not a theorist at all. I'm not an academic. I'm more of a practitioner and an advocate. But I do talk a little bit about democratic deficits. It's really helpful for people. And I think universities, I'm going to use it myself in a course that I'm teaching at Johns Hopkins in January. It's very much geared towards teaching the future generations about other ways that we can be more innovative with our democracy. So I would say if you're a student, if you're a professor, if you're an advocate, if you're someone who works in citizen engagement, if you're an elected representative, if you're a mayor or work for a mayor and you're looking for more ways, I mean, I will say I'm shocked at the number of people that I talk to every week who say, well, our engagement isn't really working, but they don't know. So we have a skills deficit. And so in that sense, I hope that the book sort of provides some of that. And, the chapter 7, which is my blueprint, really takes all the learnings from the past 4 or 5 years and tries to kind of provide recommendations on how to really design for maximum impact.
I love it. And if people wanted to reach out to you, where would they be able to find you?
You can find me at FIDE North America. I'm at Marjan at feeddemocracy.org. And I would be happy to be involved with anyone who has any questions about citizens' assemblies or just wants to talk about our democracy.
Great. And lastly, I usually always ask kind of what is something that the public gets wrong about engaging with political institutions? You mentioned there, it's not just voting every 4 years.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that they kind of usually get wrong about it?
I'm not sure that the public gets anything wrong. The public is reacting to a government that doesn't really want the public to be involved. I think it's the government that's getting the public wrong. I think the government is afraid or doesn't really have a lot. When we talk a lot about sort of people's lack of trust in government, I think the truth is that government doesn't trust its citizens. Because if government trusted citizens more, they would actually, rely on us more. They would ask for our participation. As you mentioned the word partnership, they would ask for citizens to be partners in this thing that we call democracy more. So I think it's the other way around.
I love that. Yeah, trust your citizens more. For sure, we need that. Marjan, it was great speaking to you. Thank you so much for sharing what Citizen Assembly is, and I think it's a very exciting thing. I genuinely feel like we need more of that. I think that is a great solution to the issues we're having.
Thank you so much, Hadi. This was really great. I'm glad that we have one more advocate on our side.
Yeah, definitely do it. Thank you.